This is a revision video for minority influence, which is on the specification of social influence. And minority influence includes reference to consistency, commitment, and flexibility. And throughout the video, what you really need to be thinking is, how does a minority influence a majority? So how does one person or a small group of people try and change the opinion, values, attitudes, and behaviours of a much larger group of people? So minority influence can be about everyday unimportant things, such as all your friends want to go for lunch at Subway because that's right near your college, but you want to go to the supermarket, which is a lot further away, and you want to persuade all of your friends to go with you there because you want to get the meal deal. And so you are a single person trying to influence your friends to do what you want to do. So minority influence can be about very mundane, everyday things, but they can also be about really serious issues. So for example, in September 2021, there was a minority group called Insulate Britain who want to try and change the opinion of the majority of the UK to insulate their homes because they know that that's going to be good for the environment. So they're trying to persuade people to do something they want them to do for the benefit of the environment, but the majority of people don't do it, probably because of financial cost or other reasons. So they have been doing protests. So minority influence can be both about everyday things and more serious issues. When we're talking about minority influence, then we need to consider that it's a very, very difficult thing to do. Majority influence, or just conformity, is easy because you're trying to get the smaller group of people to fit in with what everybody else is doing. But for a small group of people to influence a larger group is extremely difficult. It's very hard to win them over. And so what the minority group must do is get the majority to really consider their message or really scrutinise it. And that means that if they do get the majority to think about their issue, then that means those people are going to think about it probably very deeply. And if they do change, then that's going to get them to internalise the message. So we're talking about internalisation. And you'll remember from earlier in the unit that internalisation is a type of conformity that is very deep and long lasting because people will change their beliefs publicly and privately and probably on a permanent basis. And so with minority influence, then if they manage to achieve it, then they'll probably get people to make a permanent change. And we call that conversion, where someone converts their way of thinking to the way of somebody else. And it's very difficult to do. Normally, when we talk about conversion, we talk about it in terms of spirituality or faith or religion, where somebody has investigated another religion and they might convert to it. And it's a really meaningful thing. Conversion doesn't have to be a religious experience, but it's the actual word itself means that someone has made a big change, and it will probably be something that is permanent. So for conversion to occur, then you need the mnemonic cool cats forever. And that is where we're looking at the processes which will help a minority influence the majority. So cool cats forever, look at my cool cats there, that stands for consistency, commitment, and flexibility. And I want you to look at that picture and think that minority influence requires cool cats forever: consistency, commitment, and flexibility. So those are the processes that are going to help a minority influence the majority. And when we're talking about consistency, there are two types. Diachronic consistency means that someone has the same message over time, or the minority group has the same message over time. And that means that you don't start telling people lots of different messages about the same thing, but you stick to what you're saying because then the message is stronger and it's not diluted. So if you think about the suffragettes in history, they had the same message of votes for women for 15 years before they finally managed to achieve votes for women. But if they'd said votes for women one week and then better pay rights for women the next week and I don't know, more equality the next week, it would have diluted the message. So the message stays stronger and people are more likely to think about it if you are consistent with your message over time. And then synchronic consistency means that the people within the group, within the minority, have the same message between themselves. And so either way, it means that the message is going to be heard more by the majority and that they will consider it more deeply. Commitment is another process, and it means that you are going to make some kind of sacrifice. So usually you're going to give up some of your time and or money to show that you are making a sacrifice, and that shows your commitment to your cause or your to your message. And that means that people, once you are making sacrifices, people take it more seriously and realize that you're serious about it, and that can win them over as well. If the message is something that is really serious, like votes for women, the suffragettes movement, then people might be willing to sacrifice their human rights, so they might be willing to get arrested, but those are for the really serious issues. For the more mundane issues, like where you're going to go for lunch, then commitment is probably just time and or money. Flexibility is the last process that will help the minority be influential, and that means you've got to be willing to compromise, but there is a specific time in which you must make that compromise, and that is towards the end of the discussion or the argument. If you're flexible too early, you're seen as weak, and if you won't be flexible at all, you're seen as too rigid or dogmatic, we call it, where you are just seen as kind of stubborn, and therefore you're less likely to persuade somebody. If you show a little bit of compromise towards the end of the argument, then that will help you win over the majority. So before we move on, we're just going to apply those three processes, consistency, commitment and flexibility, to this scenario. So all your friends want to go to Reading Festival, but you want everyone else to go to the Nozstock Festival. So how would showing consistency, commitment and flexibility in this instance actually persuade your friends? So you're the minority, a single person, and so you could show consistency, and it would be diachronic consistency because you're the same person. There's only one of you, so you'd have to show diachronic consistency, which is the same message over time. So every time the discussion comes up about Reading versus Nozstock, you have to have the same message about why everyone should go to Nozstock. So for example, this year Andy C is performing at Nozstock, and that might be somebody that is all of you and your friends like, and so every time your friends say things like, well, Reading's cooler, you're like, yeah, but Andy C's performing at Nozstock. And they say, well, Reading's got more people, and you're like, yeah, but Andy C's performing at Nozstock. And you just stick with the same message, then it's more likely to go in. To show commitment in this instance, then you want to give up, you're making a bit of a sacrifice, so you could offer to drive everyone to the festival, to Nozstock Festival, and you could offer to put up the tent, and maybe you could offer to buy some snacks. And so that means that you're showing you're willing to make a sacrifice, and that might persuade people. The flexibility is really easy. You could just say, well, why don't we go to Nozstock this year and then maybe Reading next year? And so that shows that you're willing to compromise a bit at the end. So there is a key study for minority influence, and the key study can be AO1, as I've put there, which is description, or it can actually be AO3, evaluation, as well, and it depends how the question is worded. If you've got, say, a 6 marker that said explain minority influence, refer to research, then you could refer to this key study, and that's really good description. But if you've got a 16 marker which says discuss minority influence, then you've only got 6 marks to talk about all of those processes and what it means, and I would probably save this particular key study to use as evaluation, because it shows really good evidence for consistency of message and how important that is. So let's discuss the key study. Let's have a look at it. It was a laboratory experiment in which there were 2 Confederates and 4 naive participants. So you can see the 2 Confederates are in the minority. So the 6 participants sat around. They were all shown a series of slides, and all of the slides were blue, and they were asked to say out loud whether the slides were blue or green. So the Confederates, the minority, the 2 Confederates, there was one condition of the IV where it was the consistent minority, and they said green every time, and the inconsistent minority said green 2/3 of the time. And the findings are here. So the consistent minority managed to persuade the participants 8% of the time, which doesn't sound a huge amount, but it is significant because all of the slides were actually blue, and you can see the inconsistent minority had less than 1% influence, and that was almost the same as the control group who said blue. This study shows, the findings show that in order for a minority to have any effect, any influence whatsoever, they have to be consistent in their message. Otherwise, there's no point at all. If you're not consistent, then you might as well not try, because it's as if you've had no effect whatsoever. Okay, the evaluation points. So we're going to have 5 evaluation points, and the first one is Moscovici's follow-up study. Now, don't worry, you don't have to spell Moscovici because he's not in the spec. I just like the name, but you can refer to him as a researcher if you like. He did a follow-up study, and the follow-up study is actually really good evidence that the minority is more influential than it first seems, and it's evidence for internalisation and conversion. And the task was, after the original study, the participants were asked to do an individual task, and the procedure was they were given 16 discs. I've put there blue discs, ignore that. They were just given 16 discs, some obviously blue, some obviously green, and the rest were quite ambiguous. And their job was to put them in order going from blue to green. And so they had to determine a threshold for what was blue and what was green. And the findings were that the participants who had already been exposed to the consistent minority in the original study identified more of the discs as green. So Moscovici thought that they had internalised the message, but were embarrassed to publicly say it for fear of appearing weird. And this suggests that minority groups are influential. People will change their viewpoint, but on a private level. So this is really showing us that that consistent minority who said green the whole time did get in the heads of those participants, because when they had a private individual task, they identified more as green. And so the minority are actually making a difference. Even if on the surface it doesn't look like they're making a difference, then actually the minority's views are being heard. The next evaluation is a criticism, and it's a lack of external validity, which applies to both the original study and the follow-up. It was a very artificial task, so both tasks were trivial tasks of just either saying a slide was blue or green or putting those discs into order. And the consequences of the task had absolutely no, there was no comeuppance at all. There was no consequence for the individuals involved. And so it might be that because the task was so trivial that people kind of guessed the purpose or didn't care, or it just wasn't a very good task. And if you think about minority influence in real life, it's usually, it can be something incredibly serious. So for example, it could be that one member of a jury has a different opinion to the majority, with lifelong consequences for the defendant and the victim. And in that case, in a real life situation, perhaps there might be different results. The next evaluation is research support for the power of flexibility in minority influence. So this is really homing in on that idea that flexibility is a process that helps the minority be influential. And so it was a simulated jury study, and naive participants discussed a compensation payout for a ski lift accident. And a Confederate put forward a different amount of money to the majority, and then there were 3 conditions of the IV. So it was an independent group study. In the first condition, the Confederate wouldn't compromise at all and just stuck to their guns about the amount they wanted to give. In the second condition, they compromised early. And in the third condition, they compromised at the end of the negotiation. And you can see by A and B, big red cross, and that means that the participant, the Confederate, was not successful in being influential. So in condition A, wouldn't compromise, they were too rigid. In condition B, they compromised early, they were seen as too weak. But in condition C, when they compromised at the end, that was that little bit of flexibility that exerted the influence. And so that suggests that flexibility is an important process in minority influence, but that timing is absolutely key. The fourth evaluation point is a strength, and it's saying there is value of minority viewpoints in society. And so when people are exposed to minority viewpoints, they open their minds to other possibilities. They will search for information, be more creative, and make better decisions. So this is saying that minority viewpoints have a real value because they're actually helping society to become more creative and for people to find solutions where they might not have bothered before. It says having dissenters, which are people that go against what everyone else is doing, will also give freedom to others to voice their opinions. So if you're a minority or a minority group and you see other people making an influence, then you might that might give you confidence, or we call it efficacy, to go and put across your minority viewpoint. Study of dissent in work groups found that groups improved their decision making when exposed to minority viewpoints. So there was this research that was done that showed that work groups actually really benefited from having minority viewpoints when they're trying to make decisions. But the last evaluation point is a criticism, and it kind of leads on from that last one, and it's saying that actually minorities are often only accepted but in a tokenistic way. That perhaps people want to appear that they're open-minded when they're not. And so in September 2021, when Insulate Britain were annoying the nation by doing all sorts of protests, they were trying to put their point of view across, but social media went absolutely wild with criticising them. You can see a tweet there from Piers Morgan, who said, "Just drive over them. Fewer people is good for the planet anyway. Win-win." And that honestly was the tip of the iceberg. I remember just scrolling through like threads of awful tweets who were just people hating the protesters, and it seemed that they were being ridiculed and belittled, and there's this idea that perhaps dissenters are feared, and so that one way to combat that is to ridicule and belittle them, to contain their viewpoints. And so with Insulate Britain, their message that climate change will be benefited from Britain insulating their premises was lost in a tirade of angry, belittling and abusive online messages. And so this evaluation point is saying that actually people who are in a minority are often only really accepted in a tokenistic way, and in fact they might not be influential because of the fear of them, but also they are a easy group to target because they are a minority. And unfortunately discrimination occurs against all sorts of minority groups, and that includes some minority groups that are trying to protest. What I recommend you do for your revision is to, if you're my students, you can download a short answer test on minority influence, which is SP42. Just have a look on MS Teams under the Files tab. If you're not my student, I'll put a link to all the handouts that accompany this revision video that you can download. And I recommend that you try this timed essay. So in the exam, you get about 1 mark per minute plus a little bit. So if it's a 16 marker, then you should try to aim to do it in about 20 minutes or 25 with extra time. And so this is a 16 marker with a stimulus, and it says Jav, Arthur and Sammy want to go to Reading Festival, but Hugh wants everyone to go to Nozstock Festival. Discuss minority influence. Explain how Hugh should go about persuading his friends to go to Nozstock Festival. 16 marks. So when you have a 16 marker with a stimulus, then you have to discuss means outline and evaluate. So you should start your essay by outlining what minority influence is. Don't go swooping into what Jav and Arthur and Sammy and Hugh are up to. You want to discuss minority influence and the processes. That's for 6 marks. Then you have 4 marks of application in the middle, and that's where you need to explain what Hugh's going to do. How is Hugh going to persuade his friends? And I gave you a few ideas earlier in this video, but you can write your own if you want to. But you've got to get in that consistency, commitment and flexibility. And then the last 6 marks are evaluation. And I would recommend 3 evaluation marks, at least 1 strength, 1 limitation, and then 1 other that you find easy to remember, or there are 5 in this video that you could choose from. And there are your picture references.